The phone call lasted 43 seconds. I know because I checked my call log afterward. The way you do when you're trying to understand how your entire relationship with someone can collapse in under a minute. My father-in-law, Breckett Holloway, CEO, patriarch, the kind of man who keeps a framed photo of himself shaking hands with the mayor on his desk, had called to tell me I was not invited to the company's New Year dinner. Not because of a scheduling conflict. Not because the venue had a capacity issue. Because, and I'm quoting him directly, "You wouldn't fit in, Rowan. This is an elite crowd. These are our people. I'm sure you understand." I said nothing. 2 weeks later, I flew my kids to Dubai, posted the photos, and quietly sold my entire stake in his company. When he called back, and he did call back, his voice was at a pitch I had never heard from him before. He asked one question: "How long have you been the angel investor?" How did I not know? And I told him exactly one sentence, but we'll get there. My name is Rowan Callister. I'm 47. I live in Lincoln Park in a brownstone that took me 12 years to afford. I don't drive an expensive car. I don't wear watches that broadcast what I'm worth. I take the L sometimes because I genuinely like the city and I've never seen the point in being driven through it with tinted windows. I run a private investment firm, Callister Capital, that most people in Chicago have never heard of because I built it specifically to stay invisible. We fund early-stage companies at the point when everyone else thinks they're too risky to touch. Then we quietly hold until the numbers make everyone else feel foolish for waiting. I met Genevieve Holloway 4 years ago at a benefit event. She was the only person in the room actually reading the placards, not performing interest. Actually reading them, I said something about a cantilevered design being overambitious for the soil conditions. She turned around and told me calmly and correctly exactly why I was wrong. We talked for 2 hours. She was 39, divorced, 2 kids from her first marriage. Maddox, 9. Lily, 7. Her father, Breckett, ran Holloway Group, a mid-sized commercial property firm in River North. He understood optics better than fundamentals. The right suits, the right clubs, the right dinners. What he didn't have, and none of his staff knew this, was enough capital to survive the next cycle. I had been watching Holloway Group for 8 months before I ever met Genevieve. 3 separate sources in Chicago commercial real estate had mentioned the company in the context of a liquidity problem being handled with, as one contact put it, considerable creativity. That usually means someone is buying time with borrowed confidence. I pulled their filings. Had someone I trusted walk their 3 largest properties, 2 mixed-use developments in the West Loop, a business park in Schaumburg, and give me an independent read on actual market value versus what was carried on the books. The underlying assets were solid. The cash flow management was a disaster. Good bones, catastrophic stewardship. So I made the investment, anonymously. Rooted through a holding entity called Meridian Arch Holdings with no visible connection to my name. I did this for a specific reason. I wanted to know what Breckett Holloway was like when he didn't think the money in the room had a face he needed to impress. I learned a great deal. From the beginning, Breckett's assessment of me was visible in small ways. A pause before shaking my hand at that first family dinner. A question about where I'd gone to school. I said University of Illinois at Chicago and watched something settle in his expression that wasn't respect. Comments about my neighborhood disguised as observations. Lincoln Park's gotten so mixed, he said once at Thanksgiving. And I watched Genevieve go still beside me in that particular way she had when she was deciding whether to say something. He liked Garrison Price. That was the thing that sat at the center of all of it. Garrison was Genevieve's ex-husband, Northwestern MBA. Gold Coast address, the kind of man whose politeness is its own form of dismissal. He and Breckett had built a working relationship during the marriage that had apparently survived the divorce intact. In the 2nd year of our marriage, Breckett began inviting Garrison to family events. Not all of them, but enough. The Holloway Group's summer outing. A birthday dinner for Genevieve's mother, Claudette. A golf day at Medina Country Club, to which Garrison was invited and I was not. My exclusion framed as an assumption that I didn't play. I do play. No one asked. The New Year dinner is a tradition Breckett started 11 years ago. He rents the private dining room at Prime and Provisions on North Clark, one of the best steakhouses in Chicago, and invites what he considers his inner circle. Senior staff, key clients, select investors, family-adjacent figures he considers assets to the brand. I had attended the prior year. I had spent most of the evening talking with a structural engineer from Genevieve's firm who was equally uninterested in performing. This year, the invitation didn't come. I mentioned it to Genevieve casually. She came home that evening with the particular expression I had started to recognize, the one where she was holding something difficult in her hands and hadn't yet decided how to put it down. He says there's no room this year. Tighter guest list. More business-focused. I looked at her. And Garrison, she didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. He's going. Dad says Garrison's working on something with them, a potential deal. I nodded slowly. Okay, I mean it. She studied my face for a moment, then said quietly, it's not okay and I'm sorry. 2 days later, Breckett called me directly. Look, Rowan, this year we're keeping it tight. People who move in certain circles. People our clients know. You wouldn't really fit with this crowd. I'm sure you understand. He said you wouldn't really fit with the ease of someone explaining why someone wouldn't enjoy a movie rather than why they weren't welcome at one. Not malicious. Something worse than malicious. Casual. Sure, Breckett, I understand. Good man, appreciate it. 43 seconds. Call ended. I want to tell you what I did not do because I think it matters more than what I did. I did not call him back and explain myself. I did not say, do you have any idea who you're talking to? I did not ask Genevieve to intercede or escalate it into a family crisis or perform wounded dignity at the next gathering. What I've learned over 20 years in rooms where people are constantly calculating everyone else's value is this. The moment you announce your worth, you surrender something. You give the other person the ability to renegotiate. The person who needed to announce himself is already behind. The only move with a man like Breckett was to let him keep being exactly who he was. I went to my office the next morning, and I sat at my desk and I thought about what I actually wanted. I thought about Maddox and Lily, 11 and 9 by then, who had started calling me Ro, a name Maddox invented and Lily adopted. I thought about Genevieve, who deserved better than being caught between her husband and her father and her ex-husband in a revolving social performance that served everyone except her. And I thought about Meridian Arch Holdings and the investment I had made 18 months before, and the signal Breckett had just given me about who he was when he thought no one important was watching. This was not about revenge. I want to be precise about that. It was about clarity. He had given me a clean, unambiguous signal about his character. And that signal had consequences for how I evaluated the investment. I called my attorney that afternoon, then the 2 co-investors. By the following week, we had begun liquidating the stake. By December, the position was sold to a consortium led by a private equity group out of Boston called Harrove Capital, a firm known for installing their own operational leadership in companies where they identified management inefficiencies. Then I booked 4 tickets to Dubai, business class, direct from O'Hare on Emirates, a villa on Palm Jumeirah with its own pool and a view of the Atlantis from the terrace. I told Genevieve on the drive to the airport. She laughed, then something softer. You planned this for the same week as the dinner? I did. She looked at the back seat, Maddox already claiming the window, Lily deep in negotiation about it. Then she looked at me. You could have told me sooner, I could have, but you might have felt like you had to choose. A silence. Then, thank you, Rowan, we spent 7 days in Dubai. Maddox made me take the same photo from 5 different angles at the Dubai frame. Lily spent 45 minutes studying a single display case in the gold souk with the focused intensity of a tiny appraiser. We rented a boat and went out on the creek at sunset, and Maddox stood at the bow looking at the skyline like a kid, seeing something for the first time that he already knew was going to stay with him. Genevieve laughed more that week than I had heard her laugh in months. I posted 3 photos on Instagram, which I almost never use. One of the 4 of us at the Burj Khalifa, one of the kids at the beach, one of Genevieve and me at a rooftop restaurant, her laughing at something off camera, the skyline behind us looking like a city that doesn't apologize for anything. I didn't caption them. The images were their own sentence. We were back in Chicago 3 days before the call came. Thursday morning. I was reviewing a term sheet when my assistant said my father-in-law was on the line. Rowan. His voice had a quality I had never heard from him before. Not the smooth authority of a man who runs rooms, something thinner, unsteady. Were you the investor behind Meridian Arch Holdings? I let the question sit for a moment. Yes. The silence that followed was long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. How long have you been in the company? 18 months, before you married Genevieve. Yes. Another silence. I could hear him breathing. Why didn't you tell me? This was, I thought, the most interesting question he could have asked. Not why are you selling, but why didn't you tell me? Which was really asking, why didn't you announce yourself so I would have known to treat you differently? I wanted to understand the company I was investing in, I said, including its leadership. A shift in his breathing. Then, Rowan, you told me I wouldn't fit with your crowd, Breckett. I think what we've learned is that the crowd in question may have had some gaps in its information. The buyers, do you know who they are? I believe their introduction to your team is scheduled for next week. Rowan, something in his voice that might have been, had it come from a different man, the beginning of humility. Is there any way to? I think that's a conversation for you and Harrove, Breckett. A long pause. And then I said the sentence I had been thinking about for 3 weeks. You didn't want me at your table, Breckett. I respected that. I just stopped paying for it. I heard his breath catch. I said goodbye and ended the call. I drove home that evening and told Genevieve everything. The investment, the structure, the sale, the call, all of it. She sat at the kitchen island while I talked, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, and listened without interrupting. Maddox and Lily were doing homework at the dining table, their voices a low background current of arithmetic and complaint. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You've known about this since before we got married. The investment, yes, but not whether to tell him. I wanted to see who he was without knowing. She looked at her mug, then up at me. And who is he? I thought about the 43-second call, about Garrison Price at the Medina Golf Day. About the way Breckett had said you wouldn't really fit, with the ease of someone closing a door he'd never thought very hard about. He's someone who values people based on what he can see, I said. And sometimes the most important things aren't visible until you need them. She was quiet again. Then, he's going to try to make this my problem. I know. Are you ready for that? I looked at her, that specific combination of sharpness and exhaustion and love I had recognized since the first night I met her. The woman who actually reads the placards. I've been ready, I said. She nodded once, then reached across the island and put her hand over mine. For what it's worth, I think you showed more patience than most people would have. I wasn't being patient, I said. I was waiting to understand what I was dealing with. That's what patience is, Rowan. Breckett called 3 more times. The third call, I answered. I owe you an apology, he said. What I said about the dinner, the way I've treated you generally, it wasn't fair. I let it land without rushing to fill it. I misjudged you. A pause. I misjudged what you are. I noticed the phrasing. What you are, not who. Still, for Breckett, it was something. I know the Harrove transition is going to be difficult, I said, but the underlying assets are strong. If the operational piece gets cleaned up, there's a real future there. Is there any way you might consider? No, I said. I won't be reinvesting. A pause. I understand. But I'll tell you something, Breckett. If you want a relationship with me, with Genevieve, with your grandchildren, that starts with understanding that it's not conditional on what category you put me in. You have a daughter who is extraordinary. The standard for the people in her life should be higher than the clubs they belong to. The silence this time felt different, not the defensive quiet of before, something more like someone actually listening. You're right, he said finally. I know you're right. It's been 14 months since the dinner he didn't invite me to. Harrove Capital completed their operational restructuring of Holloway Group in the spring. It was not painless. 3 senior managers left. The brokerage division was reorganized. Breckett remains chairman in title, but a new president, a woman named Delaney Frost, installed by Harrove, is by every account doing excellent work. Breckett has aged a little in this time. Not broken, but humbled. Which is a different thing, and in some ways harder. He came to Maddox's 12th birthday party in February. At one point, I found him in the backyard with Maddox, who was explaining with considerable seriousness the aerodynamic principles of his new drone. Breckett was nodding, actually listening. I stood in the kitchen doorway and thought, there it is. That's what was always possible. Garrison Price no longer has a working relationship with Holloway Group. The deal he'd been cultivating fell through in the restructuring. I don't wish him ill. He was just someone Breckett had decided was elite enough, and that calculation stopped mattering once the people making it understood what they didn't know. Genevieve and I bought a larger house last summer, still in Lincoln Park. A proper yard. A room Lily has claimed as an art studio. A kitchen with actual counter space. We had a small housewarming. Breckett came. He shook my hand at the door, a different handshake from that first one 4 years ago, less assessment in it. He looked around and said, "It's a good home, Rowan." "It is," I said. We stood there for a moment, two men who have never entirely understood each other and probably won't. Then Maddox came crashing around the corner asking if he could show his grandfather the yard, and Breckett's face did something uncomplicated and real, and he said yes. I want to end with something that happened the morning after we got back from Dubai. I was up early making coffee, still jet-lagged, watching the Chicago sunrise come over the rooftops. Lily came downstairs in her pajamas, hair sideways from sleep, climbed onto the counter stool and said without preamble, "Ro, are we rich?" I looked at her for a moment. "We have enough," I said. She considered this. "More than enough or just enough?" "More than enough." "Okay." She accepted this with the complete practicality of a 9-year-old. "Can we go back to Dubai?" "Sure, someday." "Can we bring Grandpa Breckett?" I turned to look at her. She was watching me with the direct, unguarded attention of a child who hasn't yet learned to read the room for what the adults aren't saying. "Maybe," I said, "if he wants to come." She nodded as though this was a perfectly reasonable answer, then asked for cereal, and the moment passed, but it stayed with me. She didn't ask whether Grandpa Breckett was good enough to come, whether he fit, whether he was the right kind of person for the trip. She just asked if he could come. Children understand certain things about inclusion that adults work very hard to forget. Breckett Holloway spent 25 years building a world with very careful walls. He decided fast, on the surface, based on the signals he'd been trained his whole life to read. He missed a lot that way. I'm not going to tell you I handled everything perfectly. I'm not going to tell you that liquidating the investment was purely a principled business decision with no emotional component. I am 47 years old. I have been underestimated in rooms my entire career. And somewhere in me, there was satisfaction in the moment his voice went thin on that call. But satisfaction isn't the point. It was never the goal. The goal was exactly what I told him. "You didn't want me at your table. I respected that. I just stopped paying for it. Some people learn from what they can see, so I showed him.